Hi, so I'm going to explain this question as well. Excuse me, sorry. All right, so this is a sufficient assumption question. So when we get the right answer, it should close a gap so that the conclusion of this argument is guaranteed. Okay, so we want to identify the conclusion and identify the premises, and then also try to identify the gap we need to fill. Excuse me, sorry. Okay, the arousal of anger is sometimes a legitimate artistic aim, and every legitimate artwork that has this aim calls intentionally for concrete intervention in the world. Even granting that most art is concerned with beauty in some way, it follows that those critics who maintain that a concern for beauty is a characteristic of all legitimate art are mistaken. So the conclusion is this last bit here. Some clues to that would be that it comes after this phrase, it follows that. So they're saying that this statement follows from the previous statements. And so this statement is supported by the previous statements. Logically, this statement would flow from the previous ones. So the statement must be the conclusion of the argument. Another clue is that right before they introduce the conclusion, they're giving us a bit of a concession. So even granting that most art is concerned with beauty in some way, that's a concession that they're making. So what they're saying is that this statement here, that most art is concerned with beauty in some way, that doesn't necessarily support the conclusion and actually maybe seems like it would go against the conclusion. But they're saying, well, what we can concede that, we can allow for that to be true, and yet still the statements that we made previously would support the conclusion. So this bit here wouldn't be support for the conclusion. It's a counter premise. So it's not like a premise, it's against, it's actually going against the conclusion. So it's a counter premise. All right. Oh, okay. Just gonna pause for a second. Okay, I'm back. I have a lozenge now, so if my voice sounds different, maybe that's what. Okay. So their conclusion is that critics who say that concern for beauty is a characteristic of all legitimate art are mistaken. So what's the conclusion? The conclusion is that beauty is not a characteristic of all legitimate art, which is to say that not all legitimate art cares about beauty. So some legit art does not care about beauty. That's what their conclusion is. So in order to prove that statement, that some legitimate art doesn't care about beauty, all we need to do is find an example of legitimate art that doesn't care about beauty, right? So like one example of a type of art that is legitimate that doesn't care about beauty would be good enough. Have they given us anything like that in the premises, right? So we want to see what part of this statement do the premises already support? And then where is the gap, where the gap is? So here, sometimes anger, arousing anger is a legitimate artistic aim. So that's where we get like the some part, where we actually do have an example of some legitimate art. They say every legitimate art that has this aim. So there's legitimate art that has that aim, and it would call intentionally for concrete intervention in the world. So that's some legitimate art, right? They're describing characteristics of some kinds of legitimate art. The part that we haven't established with that is the part where it's not concerned with beauty, it doesn't care about beauty, right? So what we would want to know is that if it has this kind of artistic aim, or it calls intentionally for concrete intervention in the world, like either of these things, if it does one of those things, and therefore that means that it doesn't care about beauty, then we would be able to get to the conclusion, right? So what we're kind of missing here is the assumption that they have that because art aims to arouse anger, or because it calls for concrete intervention in the world, it can't also be concerned with beauty. That's kind of what they're assuming, right? That like that kind of art that it's describing beforehand isn't concerned with beauty. And so what we need to do is we need to close the gap by saying those two things are like mutually exclusive. You can't do both, right? So understanding what would be necessary for like the conclusion to be true, or like what would be sufficient for the conclusion to be true, actually, like all we would need, right? That like all of the necessary things, right? Not just one necessary thing, but like what would be enough to get us to the conclusion completely, to guarantee the conclusion, would just be an example of some kind of legitimate art that doesn't care about beauty. And here they've given us an example of some characteristics of a type of legitimate art. But what they haven't done is rule out that this art cares about beauty. So we need to rule that out by saying that if art has these kinds of characteristics, it can't also be concerned with beauty. And so if we look at our options here, A says there are works that are concerned with beauty, but that aren't legitimate works of art. We don't really care about that, right? We care about the kinds of legitimate art that don't care about beauty. That's what we need for the conclusion. So that one is one of those ones that's using a lot of the same language, but like it actually doesn't help the argument at all. B, only those works that are exclusively concerned with beauty are legitimate works of art. That would not help the argument. That would hurt the argument, because the argument is saying that being concerned with beauty isn't a characteristic of all legitimate art, that people who think that are actually mistaken. So this is what the critics might think, although the critics probably aren't even being that extreme, because the critics are just saying that concern for beauty is a characteristic rather than it's the only thing that they care about. So B is just like wrong completely. It would hurt the argument that we're trying to support by adding a sufficient assumption. So this is not the correct answer, and also it doesn't even really characterize the critics' conclusion. C, here it talks about secondary concern. There's nothing in the argument about primary or secondary concern. It's just whether it's a characteristic or not. So it being a secondary concern, would still be a characteristic. So that's not going to help us. D, no works of art that call for intervention are concerned with beauty. So this is really helpful because it says if it calls for intervention, then it's not concerned with beauty, right? So if we were to understand this as a conditional statement, we would read it as if a work of art calls for intervention, then it is not concerned with beauty. And that's really helpful because we know that there are legitimate artworks that call for concrete intervention. And so if it's also true that those works of art are not concerned with beauty, then it would be true that there's some legitimate art that is not concerned with beauty, doesn't care about beauty, which is exactly what our conclusion is. So D really helps with that. It's saying those things are mutually exclusive. E, only works that call for intervention are legitimate works of art. So this one is not helping us get to our conclusion about legitimate art not being concerned with beauty, right? So we do really need an answer choice that has something to do with a concern for beauty, because that's the part of our conclusion that kind of comes out of nowhere, right? So and it's a part of our conclusion that is not supported by the premises. So kind of coming back to this identifying the beginning of the last sentence as being a concession, that's helpful in understanding that that concession isn't support or a premise for the conclusion. It's a counter premise. So it's something that doesn't actually support the conclusion, but we're just sort of granting it as a concession to the other side. So if you look at the premises don't mention beauty at all, right? So the first sentence, those two premises in there don't mention concern for beauty at all. Then concern for beauty comes up in a counter premise, and then it comes up in the conclusion. And so concern for beauty actually isn't supported by the premises as an idea. And so it's not logically connected to the rest of the argument. So if you have something that's in the conclusion that isn't logically supported by the premises, then that's something that you really are going to want to have in the answer choice for sufficient assumption, because that's really identifying for you where that gap is if there's this idea that's present in the conclusion but not the premises. So yeah, this one also saying that only works that call for intervention are legitimate. Yeah, it doesn't go to strengthen or support the conclusion at all. And it just kind of is changing one of the premises so that rather than saying that when legitimate artwork aims to arouse anger, it calls for concrete intervention in the world, rather than saying like that doing this is what makes it legitimate. It's saying instead, no, like if it is legitimate and it wants to arouse anger, then it's going to call for intervention. So E is kind of just a confusion of one of the premises and adding something that does not get us closer to the conclusion.